are here, Shannan?
Yes, I am.
Good. Okay, let's go. All right. Are you going to introduce the project, Tessa?
Yep. Hi, thanks Ian for that really great talk. It's really nice to come after a discussion of urban and rural relationships and Agnes Denner's. And I also wanted just initially to pick up on the mention of Nadia and this idea of encountering phantoms of the past. That kind of invisible past is definitely something that was a key driver in our approach and in most of our work. I think it just occurred to me when I was sitting there before, there's a kind of fabulist archaeology in a way in what we were conducting in this place. So the question that we brought into our residency was, how do we draw out what is not readily visible in that place, which does, as I said earlier, come out partly from the historical event, but also is, necessarily shaped by our own kind of interpretive construction. Okay, so, in this particular work, more so than some of our others, but it's something that does come up again and again, is a conflation of a lot of different times. So there's a layering between a retelling of what actually happened with what could have happened, and then also what could potentially still happen. So trying to break down those categories of past, present, future, which can be quite limiting.
And I would also suggest, following on from the last talk, that binary between the idea of the urban and the rural and the necessary kind of idyllic framing that is often urban-centric of the rural, that I think that there's some complexity in working in that way.
So just as an introduction to, I guess, the story behind this work, the narrative begins really with the story of Claude Antoine Gaspard Riche, 1792, who was a French naturalist. With the expedition that gave Esperance its name, he was lost when the ship stopped there and kind of wandered off and spent several days thirsty and hungry and surrounded by food that he didn't recognise as such. And so, why that story was really interesting to us and what we were trying to do with it was to take that and use it as a way of assessing our position in the land and our relationship to the land in a place like Esperance today. So the way that we moved... we're interested in asking, have we actually moved anywhere towards understanding how this landscape might support us, beyond the next few decades, which is obviously something that would entail, a much more serious and kind of ongoing dialogue with Indigenous knowledge than we kind of have in most parts of this country.
Could I interject as well, again, picking up on what was said in the last presentation, that idea of culture inside agriculture and that idea of, I think, the notion of the urban or the city being kind of rooted in the, I guess, technological or design leap of moving from the nomadic to the capacity to farm and cultivate is something that misses out on, we talked about the history of agriculture, the prehistory of agriculture, and that break actually created or limited a set of futures that were available, and that's some of what we sort of, I think, looked at in this work as well. Yeah,
we have a kind of design background and design theory, sustainability, so it's definitely, I guess, how we approached it. In terms of the process of making the work, how we entered into that particular historic narrative, which is almost kind of mythic, in how it's understood by a lot of people, was to seek out those people in town who have knowledge around what the land there can produce in terms of food, or those who were interested in just joining us in our kind of, in some ways, amateur investigation in this process. And these are people who might not necessarily have interacted much with each other in that context. And those individuals, so I guess in this case, these people formed a kind of provisional community around the process that we'd put in place. Rather than being representative of like the community, they then, as well as kind of helping us and kind of participating in this process of looking for things, became involved in what was quite an elaborate situation that we staged on one of the biggest kind of salt lakes around Esperance, Pink Lake.
Okay.
So we staged this situation. We then document it. That forms the kind of basic part of the installation, which is the video. We were looking at some pictures before. As it happened, almost exactly 219 years to the day after Rish found himself on the edges of Pink Lake and actually thinking it was the ocean, started walking towards it and kind of got, progressively more and more lost. So what we did on the lake, it was a meal based around the foods that we had collected over the course of the residency, and using a whole lot of objects that were kind of really very generously lent to us by people in town. And the form of that scene that you can see comes out of it's done in a series of minute-long poses. So it's kind of roughly what you would have to, the length of time you'd have to take to pose for a photograph. Early 1900s photographs. And the form came out of a lot these archives. These ones are from J.J. Dwyer, who was a goldfields photographer around Kalgoorlie. And, there is a really strong connection between Kalgoorlie and Esperance. And there's also local equivalent archives that we were lucky enough to access through the Historical Society and all sorts of really helpful people. So these kind of pictures often show people out in the landscape eating or, picnicking with a camel or whatever else. And we found them really fascinating because this is more of bringing out that kind of invisible history that does shape how we live. And they're very recent. It's maybe 100 years ago. But you can see that there's a very kind of obvious disconnect between the land and how the people are living in it, which very much shapes still how we occupy it now. And also useful, interesting for us because this type of imagery is how we're used to encountering, history, capital H history. So putting ourselves as outsiders, but also the participants from the community, quite absurdly in a way out of place and also out of time in this constructed scene, was quite a unique experience and provided almost a kind of embodied way of thinking about time and about our relationship to place.
How many more bits have you got to go?
Nothing, that's all.
Okay.
So, just that experience was quite interesting, and separately, almost every single person who was in it came up to us afterwards and said how just sitting there had actually given them all these ideas for whether it was art projects or things that they could do in their own kind of creative world. So that was quite an interesting process.
Yeah, and I thought that would be an interesting point to bring in Shannan and Dewi. Shannan is the coordinator, director, head honcho, kind of like super person of the Cannery Arts Centre who hosted us, and Dewi also heavily involved in the Cannery, but is a very kind of talented artist and also a very special kind of super person that was our assistant, but really was like the third of the three amigos, like driving around in his
he was our man on the inside.
He was our man in Havana, like working through the Esperance landscape and the surrounds, and helping us to kind of negotiate this kind of strange process, which in and of itself was something that unfolded over time. So I thought I'd ask both Dewi and Shannan to kind of... Shannan also posed in the photo, and Dewi also photographed the photo using his bellows camera, which is very much from around the same sort of period that we were looking at this photo archive. So I'm just going to open it up to you two. I know you said you didn't want to talk a lot, but here you go.
All right. Throughout the proceedings today, I've just been making a few notes because I noticed a lot of the presentations have picked up on similar themes, similar points. So if I can just, I'm not a very good speaker, so I'll just kind of glance at notes, and someone else mentioned a stream of consciousness sort of delivery. So from my perspective, I saw this stuff working with time, with place, with weather, which is a really kind of basic, often boring concept, but it affected a lot of the projects and really affected ours powerfully. And with light. I really liked the way that Sohan spoke earlier about light. I'm a photographer, but very often I don't think consciously about light the way he spoke about it. I think about it technically, but he provided a far deeper sense of meaning to the use of light. I especially like the way he, drew parallels to spirits and revelation that comes out of light. And it also brought to mind a line from a Leonard Cohen song. He talks about there's darkness, but there's cracks in the darkness so the light can come in. And I think a lot of these IASCA projects, especially this one in Esperance, was opening up those cracks in the darkness, talking about buried histories, about conflicting narratives, environmental issues, most of which, especially in a small country town, are all too often not talked about. So having some outsiders come in, it almost gave us the freedom to start imagining and exploring some of these ideas. So I've got IASCA and the artists to thank for that. I'm not quite sure what else I've got to say there. Personally, I was speaking to Karl and Tessa out in the courtyard earlier, and there's been a lot of talk about social efficacy in community arts practices, and often kind of emphasis on community outcomes. And from my perspective, there was a lot of selfishness in what was given to us in Esperance. It was a fairly small number of people that worked very closely together, some of whom didn't actually know each other very well before that. But we've become a lot closer and engaged in discussion about a lot of similar ideas now. There's several artists, including myself, who've been inspired to think beyond our usual boundaries and are exploring, different ideas in our own arts practices. And that will feed back, as I said, it seems selfish, but ideally that will feed back into community. So I think that's the kind of things IASCA are trying to promote, and it's the kind of things that Karl and Tess generously brought to us. That's about it. Thanks.
Did you want to say anything further on that, Shannan? This can open out into a wider idea about, the future of a town like Esperance, and the capacity of not only the arts, but the different people that were involved in that photo shoot having a particular kind of knowledge that doesn't necessarily get, acknowledged, made visible, or connected together.
I think when Makeshift came into town, it's an interesting point in time for Esperance. We're traditionally a farming, rural town, wheat, sheep, and we've also got a port. The port has since had massive expansion that's opened up mining coming into Esperance. You may have heard of the lead scandal that we've had down there, poisoning our local environment. We've now been announced that we're going to be one of the new super towns. I think this has created a bit of a grassroots disillusionment with power structures within the community. There seems to be a high level of decision making that is not factoring in a sense of community. It's looking at Esperance on a very economic scale. This is where Makeshift has come to Esperance to do this project. So I think it has drawn together different sectors of community and linked us back together. Whereas perhaps if Makeshift hadn't come into town, we'd all be sort of thinking along these similar lines, but having no way of joining together with our sense of community.
Is that really happening?
Yeah.
Yeah, wow, that's really interesting.
It's interesting because we had this kind of historical angle, but we're also really, that's only interesting in the service of where we're going. So,
15, we'll finish up.
yeah, just to finish on the future, these stereoscope slides, which are what you can see in the room through the 19th century French stereoscope. This is kind of views of Esperance now relating to food production or how the town feeds itself. So you've got the supermarket. I mean, all the food gets trucked down from Perth, and all the stuff that gets made there is kind of behind closed doors and doesn't, end up in Esperance.
Yeah, I think that realistically, just to sort of finish up and tie things together, because there are a lot of different things in it, that in having a range of different ways of looking and seeing is the opportunity that we sort of took up in working in Esperance. That there's this question of, I guess, landscape and the picturesque in art practice, certainly in a kind of traditional idea of art practice, that we're also interested in other concepts of sort of memory and inventing and fictionalising and creating stories around the archive. And yet there are ways of thinking about the future and looking forward, and that it allows you to kind of observe what's around you as the potential for critique, so that, have a look upstairs, you'll see the videos, but then like underneath you can have a look at the stereoscopic slides. Each one of those is, I guess, a food future or deep futuring of Esperance, which are in and of themselves as much a futuring or deep futuring of Australia or even the globe in some way. That the idea of moving things around on boats, whether they be sheep or grain, moving around on trucks, putting fertiliser in the ground so that we can get stuff to grow where it shouldn't. All these things will both feed and be, I guess, a question of the limits that we have as a human species, which was discussed.
Yeah, and certainly, it was really great to have such an extended period of time in the town, because the more and more we were there, the more and more these little, very kind of, sinister, dark stories kept coming out to us from people just in the museum or wherever else about things that were happening which don't quite fit in with the, the more, I guess, stereotypical short-term view that a lot of people have of Esperance as, great little holiday town, go to the beach.
Australia's best beach,
Yeah, so...
Thank you.
Great.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Okay. That's it. Yeah, cheers.